Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined again by Keith Preston of Attack the System to discuss the left's view of freedom and whether universal healthcare and education do in fact make people more free. Tim.
Well, me and Swithin are both libertarians of the right-wing variety, and if you look at sort of normie progressives, even some conservatives, of the last 100 years, those groups, and particularly the radical left, if you look at their big achievements, if you made a list and if you asked them, they would say something like universal health care. Now, in the United States, we don't have universal health care in the European sense, but although since Obamacare, we have maybe 2/3. I'm not a policy wonk, so I don't know the precise numbers, but it's a fairly high number, as well as mass schooling. And the question is, does universal health care and does what is known as free and compulsory education make us freer? The idea for this conversation began from a while back. There was a great episode with Christopher Hitchens was on Russ Roberts' podcast, Econ Talk. Russ Roberts, of course, is sort of like a beltway libertarian. And Christopher Hitchens was discussing his book on Orwell. Back in the 40s, Orwell reviewed Hayek, and this is what the question was stated. The question is, Russ Roberts asked, Orwell reviewed Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and he was asked, what was Orwell's views on Hayek? And Hitchens responds, the role played by Hayek in 1944-45 is now forgotten. Churchill made a speech in 1945 election, having led the British people through the war, and the Labour Party to institute a national health care, that was his plan, the socialized policy. And then Hayek responds, this might require a Gestapo bureaucracy. And British people were in no mood to be talked in that way, and talking about healthcare requiring a Gestapo didn't spell well. This speech supposedly suggested to Churchill by Hayek himself. Churchill lost the election, possibly because of the known as the Gestapo speech. When Orwell reviewed The Road to Serfdom around that time, he's a short review, understood the book, begins saying it's the wrong book at the wrong time, prefers the risk run by state intervention to the risk of laissez-faire or capitalism. However, Orwell adds, almost as an afterthought, it would be stupid to ignore the point that Hayek is making. In share of national income past a certain point will lead to tyranny. And then, just to summarize here, the Labour Party's platform was basically if you give people, get freedom from dangerous diseases, freedom from the terror of getting sick and going bankrupt, and owning their own homes and various things. You take away that, you make people more free. And my question is, and as a sort of libertarian, is that true? Is that true? Because one of the interesting points is that the free stuff always comes with strings attached, and it comes with this large bureaucracy, this large managerial state. And the related point is the education. The education system was sold on a similar grounds. It gave people, quote unquote, free education. It got them in, but put people arguably in a situation of dependency. And the state education, of course, in a similar way, puts them literally in cahoots with the state, and the state gets to control the curriculum, whoever is controlling the state, which of course will be the elites. So is Christopher Hitchens thinks that the sort of Labour Party platform has made everyone freer, free education, free healthcare, or nationalized education, nationalized healthcare. Is that true, Keith?
Well, the first question that obviously arises from this is, how do you even go about defining the concept of freedom? Freedom is not something for which there's a universal consensus as far as its definition. Of course, you guys being right libertarians, you tend to define freedom in terms of negative freedom, that is the freedom of the individual from direct physical coercion, which would mean things like, for example, there's no law against walking a dog without a leash or something like that. If you walk a dog without a leash, you're not going to get arrested or fined or something like that. So that tends to be the libertarian and classical liberal and traditional conservative model of what freedom is. Now, there's also a different version of freedom that's based on the concept of positive freedom, and this is more about the freedom as the ability to achieve goals or the ability to exercise choices. For instance, I had someone tell me once that when they had lived in another country outside the United States, they had so much more freedom because there were a greater variety of soft drinks to choose from, or teas or flavors of coffee or something like that. Now, this was some years ago. This was about 30 years ago before, this designer coffee industry really became a thing. But what this person meant is that freedom means the having a wide range of options and choices available to you. The idea that the welfare state increases freedom is rooted in the idea that it increases freedom from this or that form of insecurity, freedom from the fear of unemployment, freedom from falling deep into debt because of medical bills, freedom from being ignorant because you haven't been able to afford an education, freedom from being subject to the market forces, like, say, the employers and the policies that are imposed by the employer that you work for. So when people say that the welfare state increases freedom, that's what they mean. They're defining freedom in a different way. Of course, a lot of people from the left in its present form would say, well, you have to have freedom from discrimination, freedom from prejudice, freedom from social exclusion and ostracism. If we wanted to, we could make a long list of the ways in which different philosophical viewpoints define freedom. So there's no consensus on what freedom actually is. Now, I personally am sympathetic to the right libertarian point of view, because I tend to think that the idea that the state is going to be everyone's sugar daddy is problematic. And the idea that, well, the state is something that gives us health care and gives us education and gives us all these other things, a federal jobs guarantee and solar power and all these things we want, with people being conditioned to view the state in that way, I think is a problem. If we want to see where that leads, I remember when Kim Il-sung, the founder of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or whatever it's called, the DPRK, when he died back in 1994, we're talking about the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea. I remember seeing members of the North Korean army hugging statues of Kim Il-sung, saying, "Oh, he had taken care of me since I was an infant," and it was like their dad had died or something like that. And while I certainly don't agree with those people on the right who think that universal health care is comparable to Stalinism, I think that's a ridiculous analogy. I do see a problem with people being socially conditioned to view the state as a sugar daddy in that way, that somebody's going to take care of you and provide you with all the things you need and things like that. Now, I am sympathetic to the viewpoint that there are forms of authoritarianism or oppression or repression or whatever besides the political government itself, that is, beside the actual law, the laws of the state. I would not want to be in the shoes of somebody who is dependent on Jeff Bezos for their basic livelihood. And I think that the kind of healthcare system we have in the United States, where medical bankruptcy is the leading cause of bankruptcy, that is, people just aren't able to pay their medical bills. They have terrible illnesses or injuries, and they incur bankruptcy because of that. I do think that is problematic. I don't think that's just a trivial matter. Now the approach that I would take, though, would be somewhat different from either the Social Democrats' point of view or the conventional right libertarian view. And that the first thing I would want to look at is, what is it that makes education unavailable if the state's not providing it? Or what is it that makes health care unavailable if the state is not providing it? Now, my view is that there's a wide range of institutional policies that have been created at the state level through government policy and through collusions that exist between government and other institutions in ways that make education less available if it's not provided by the state, or make health care less available if it's not provided by the state. Um, the in, in France, for example, before the rise of the welfare state, one of the primary means in which people were provided with health care and medical insurance and things like that was through mutual aid societies. And one of the effects of the welfare state is that it has the effect of crowding out other options besides either government or people simply doing without. Now, I think there's a problem with the idea that, well, the all welfare should be something akin to private charity, like the Salvation Army or something like that. A lot of right libertarians, that's a standard position that they take, as if that's going to be a cure-all. I'm not so sure that I really buy that, but I generally share the viewpoint that this idea that the state is going to be the party that gives you everything that you want or need is problematic for a wide range of reasons. I could come up with a long list of reasons why I think that's a problem. And when I see people like the Bernie Sanders fans out there saying, well, what's really so great about Bernie is he wants to give everybody Medicare for all and free college, and I guess those are two of the big ones. Even Andrew Yang's idea, the universal basic income and all that kind of stuff, I do see this idea that the state is going to be your sugar daddy as being a serious issue, and I would prefer that not be the basis of political organization, because whatever the state is giving you, whatever carrot they're holding out, whether it's the things we're talking about now or something else, the stick is behind the carrot. The stick is always going to be behind the carrot, and I think that's a problem. The social democrats, the problem that I have with them is that they somehow think the state can be benevolent. They think that the state can really be like your parents, or not that all parents are benevolent, but most parents probably do the best they can with what they have to work with. The social democrats tend to think that the state is somehow value neutral, in the sense that, well, if only we elect the right people, and if only we structure the state in a way that's most workable according to what we want, we're going to be able to have this kind of sugar daddy government. And I don't think that's how states work. I think that that's a complete misunderstanding of what the state is. Saying that the state should be the person or the entity that provides you with all the things that you need, whether it's income, healthcare, education, all this other stuff, it's kind of like saying, well, the mafia should provide everybody with healthcare and education and a universal basic income and those things. And in fact, organized crime groups do that on occasions when they want to win the favor of local populations for whatever reason. They will go out and actually pretend to be do-gooders and provide people with things that they need, but they'll do it in a way that there's always some ulterior motive. There's always something that you owe them in return. There's always some sort of element of manipulation or exploitation that's behind that, and that's where I see the problem coming in with this entire social democratic paradigm.
With respect to how healthcare took place in France prior to the welfare state, it's somewhat similar to the UK. You had lots of friendly societies in the 19th century and early 20th, which were crowded out. So I think that seems to be at least a reasonably common experience in Western Europe. And I would also agree with you that barriers to entry, licensing requirements, patents, etc., in medical fields do prevent alternatives to the current way of operating that would give sort of more genuine choice and different levels of services that could otherwise exist. That's also the case with education. I think actually in England it's slightly less bad than the US in certain respects. At least in England you can basically home educate without telling the state at all. They have an obligation to find out, but you don't have an obligation to tell them. But the schooling system, etc., is, even if it is private, it's essentially running the government's exams, and it's directed in the way that they want it to be directed. And so there is relatively little choice outside some of the more ideological schools, things like the democratic free schools, Sudbury Valley is one in the US of that, where basically kids can just do what they want all day, and they vote on school rules, and each teacher and the pupils have the same amount of votes. Well, no, well, one pupil, one vote, one teacher, one vote, and they're all equal. I do think the main point, though, Keith, you point out, is the conception of freedom here. In a way, freedom is, in a sense, a nebulous term, depending how it's used. Really, I think to a large extent, people have different views on what kind of, what a good life is, what a flourishing life looks like, and then probably more important in this context is how to achieve it. To have the flourishing life, you need to have certain material, you might say various material wealth and possessions and health and education, for example. And so therefore we need the state to provide those so you can have a flourishing life. That would be a sort of a version of a leftist position you could hold. But the point you made, Keith, I thought was interesting, that the state always has the cards, is even if we grant a more broadly leftist view of freedom, the current coronavirus situation has pointed out how that kind of freedom that's provided by healthcare simply doesn't exist when the state doesn't want it to. Because in the UK we have the National Health Service, which is essentially, you could call it a Stalinist system, really. The whole British economy isn't, but it's clearly a nationalised body in which it's free at the point of use, and prices don't really mean very much. The justification for the lockdown in the UK was primarily to save the NHS. They even had a situation at Thursday nights at 8 o'clock. People went outside to clap for the NHS. The NHS is basically the closest thing to a functioning religion in the United Kingdom. Because of this lockdown, you're going to have loads of people dying from cancer because the diagnoses were too late. There's loads of people who had slower, less treatment than they otherwise would, or not as acute treatment because because it was because of the lockdown, etc. So the idea that the public provision of healthcare gives people more freedom as such is, I think, being shown not necessarily to be true in this case. Tim, what do you think?
I would generally agree with both of your conception. I like Keith's point about the state being a sugar daddy as well as the stick behind it. And I would like him to expand somewhat on this point. Is there a difference between the conception of even if we grant, of course, this sort of positive rights view that the left has, even if we were to grant this, does this still hold true? I mean, if you went back in time and showed this to the Labour Party, what the NHS looks today, would they be happy with it? Harold Lasky. In the same way, if you showed, the American socialists from the 1930s, after the New Deal or whatever, and after the Obamacare, would they be happy with? Would they happy with they delivered, or is there this large bureaucracy? Is it not as good as they wanted? With the education system, I think universal education is actually a little more pernicious here in the United States, because the education system is always, in some ways, a plot to get good obedient soldiers and good obedient workers. I think the education system, because the United States is sort of modeled more after the Prussian model to a certain extent. So the two questions there is the socialized medicine and socialized education as good as the historic reformers? Would they have been happy with it? And is the stick how pernicious is the stick behind it? Keith?
Well, when we ask what would past generations think of how some idea they had was actually implemented, we have to remember that no plans for utopia or whatever ever turn out the way people really want them to. I hear people asking that question all the time about the founders of the United States. If George Washington could see what America is today, what would he think? Would he think, wow, I helped found this glorious empire, or my God, what did we do? Who knows what someone from past times would really think about something that happened generations later. Clearly, the public health systems that we have in developed societies are not utopian systems. When I listen to debates that take place in the United States about what the model healthcare system would be, of course you have all these people who say, well, our system in the United States should be more like the British system, or more like one of the European systems, or the Canadian system, or something like that. And they'll point out ways in which some of those systems may have advantages over what goes on in the United States. And then the other side will come back with some kind of argument about, well, no, actually, they don't have this in Canada, or they don't have this in England, or whatever. And I tend to look at it like with something like healthcare, there is no perfect system. But one thing that's unique about healthcare is that it's capital intensive and labor intensive and has a near universal demand. So something like that is going to be expensive, irrespective of what kind of structural mechanisms you have for healthcare delivery. And any kind of structural system that you have for something like healthcare is going to have some sort of deficiency. I don't think there's any way around that. There is no utopian healthcare system. As far as education, I tend to view education as sort of like the modern equivalent of the church. If we look at the historic role that the church played in Western societies, the church was basically the institution that was the arbiter of values and morals and ethics, or what was considered to be morally appropriate, and as well as the creating this sort of ideological superstructure of the wider society. As the church and religion generally has declined in terms of its influence in the last couple of centuries, that's been replaced by other institutions like education, and also increasingly the mass media. And I also think science and medicine and things like that play a role in that as well. I think all of these things collectively are sort of like the new church. The media, the educational system, technology, science, medicine, the ideas industries in general. And we could get into things like public resources and public relations, rather, and human resources and marketing and all that, if we wanted to go down that road. But one of the main arguments or criticisms, of course, that many conservatives have of the educational system, at least in the United States, is they say, well, the problem with the educational system is that they're just indoctrinating students with leftist propaganda, which is true in some school systems, a lot of school systems, and with varying degrees of extremes and things like that. I think that's becoming more and more the issue over time. Now, of course, a lot of the critics of that, what they really object to is that they're not the ones who are doing the indoctrination. I think a lot of conservatives, for example, want to, if they could, would indoctrinate the students with a lot of nationalist propaganda, or in some cases a lot of religious propaganda. So it's basically, well, the other tribe is the one that's controlling the propaganda system. That it's not that they're necessarily interested in some sort of education organized as some sort of Socratic dialogue. That's not what they have in mind. It's just a matter of who gets to control the propaganda system. But I think that all of these kinds of institutions do have this kind of role of arbitrating the values of the wider society. You were talking, Swithin, about this idea that we need to have this lockdown because we've got to control the pandemic because it's going to overburden the National Health Service or whatever. That's an argument that I've heard many times in the United States for all sorts of laws and prohibitions and things like that. One argument that's always been used in favor of drug prohibition is, well, if somebody becomes a drug addict and they become unproductive and they become a welfare dependent, or they are if they have bad health and have to go to rehab for drug addiction or whatever, then the state's going to have to pick up the tab for that, or somebody else is going to have to pick up the tab through insurance or whatever. And of course, they even use those kinds of arguments for things like gun laws. I haven't heard this said for a while, but I used to hear people saying, well, gun control is a public health issue, basically meaning that, well, people get gunshots and they're wounded or whatever and have to be rushed to the emergency room or for whatever emergency medical care. And that, of course, is a cost that's imposed on the healthcare system. I've even heard that argument used for things like regulating smoking and regulating foods people eat. Like I know when Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York, he was big on trying to cut back on keeping people from drinking beverages with too much sugar or eating food with too much fat, sort of like a health fascist or whatever he would be called. And that's a common argument that is used for all sorts of laws. Like another one is compulsory seat belts and motorcycle helmets and stuff like that. If someone is injured or disabled for not wearing a safety device, then they're going to become a public charge. So it does seem to me that this kind of thing is a problem. This kind of thing that says, well, anything that may impose costs must be controlled or must be banned because of it's going to be a burden on society or whatever. And that whole way of thinking is intertwined with this idea of a pervasive welfare state, the idea that the state is there to take care of you, but then the state doesn't have unlimited resources. Just because it's the government doesn't mean it has unlimited resources. So of course there's always going to be things that have to be rationed to some degree that the state is not going to be able to cover the cost of. And then that's when you get into this idea of, well, okay, if the state is providing health care, they're going to need to ration health care on the basis of need or whatever the issue may be. So that means that people who need something like an MRI or something, they might have to wait a long time to get this MRI, and then that can be very damaging because if they've got a cancerous tumor or something, that needs to be diagnosed as quickly as possible. So it seems to be sort of a never-ending circle that keeps perpetuating all of these kinds of problems.
I would totally agree. I would agree with almost everything you just said there, Keith. One thing I want to follow up on is the point about positive rights. And unlimited demand. The state doesn't have, although the state at times claims it can fix all problems, it doesn't necessarily mean it can fix all problems. As well as this is another problem I have with sort of the social democrats' view, as well as even many left anarchists. I've seen a few interviews you've done, like with someone like Brent Langel. I've seen you done interviews, and one of my problems in general with most social democrats or the left anarchists I can see is they have a fairly conservative view of what healthcare is. I mean, for one thing, they basically say that. I mean, this is where I think a person like Michel Foucault is really interesting. He had an interview back in the 80s. We said that healthcare is sort of a cultural fact. What's part of healthcare? Like, people include therapy, but you could arguably include, if you're a religious person, you could arguably include church services. And that's actually an interesting thing recently brought about the lockdown. There could be more suicides and more other things because people don't have, social interaction or things like that. So on the one level, they have a very, it basically consists of pharmaceuticals, and pharmaceuticals and capital-intensive procedures, and things like that. As far as the point about it being conservative, as far as the point about it being, is like people use, public gun health laws are, public gun laws are. Gun safety is a public health crisis. That's one reason why that's one reason why I don't want state socialized healthcare. I think if, in my view, I'm not a conservative in this sense. In my view, when the conservatives say you can't have gay sex because it might lead to X, Y, and Z diseases. Now, whether or not empirically it leads to that is of some question. But in the same way, I think that's as true of an argument. And I made that as a comment on someone's Facebook post early on in the coronavirus, say you can't go out because you might kill grandma. Well, and that will lead to a ventilator shortage. Well, I mean, you can make the same argument in a sort of abstract sense for smoking or all other things that, the left and right can throw those arguments out, gun rights or things like drug use and things like that. So that's why I'm right libertarian. And when left libertarians like Chomsky, I mean, after all, Chomsky calls radicalism, ends up basically being a social democrat, which, I mean, he's radical in some sense, not radical in another sense. But as far as the, what is healthcare and what isn't healthcare, why is the I mean, you're more closer to them. Why is the left have such a, albeit conservative view? Like, why don't they include alternative medicine? I mean, alternative medicine gets a bad name. Like things like chiropractic and physical therapy. Like here in the United States, many of those things aren't included. Now, I'm not sure if I want them to be included. If you include them, they probably get regulated and they probably get crowded out. So I don't want them necessarily to get included. But even like the business of delivering, there's a book called The Business of Birthing or something like that. There's a lot of cottage industry of people having children at home now because A, to avoid the high cost, but B, it's just basically like a giant factory in the hospital. So but in general, Keith, why do the left have this sort of, the healthcare consists of the doctors and hospitals. It's very narrow. Keith?
Well, that depends on what sector of the left that you're talking about. There are certainly sectors of the counterculture left that are interested in alternative medicine or what they call holistic medicine and all of these kinds of things. I certainly know people who are definitely leftists who have an interest in that kind of stuff, just like there's a far right subculture that's also interested in stuff like that as well. But I think on the more mainstream level, when it comes to the mainstream left, one problem that the left has is this kind of cult of scientism. One of the flaws, I mentioned earlier that in modernity, the science and medicine and education and the media have sort of taken the place of religion as the disseminator of values in the wider society. And one of the values of modernity is scientism, this kind of deification of science, which is an idea that comes out of the Enlightenment, this idea that everything can be understood in scientific terms, and then you can come up with rationally defined scientific laws that determine how reality works, and then through the application of scientific principles, you can not only improve society but also achieve human perfectibility in more radical versions of this idea. So you have this kind of religion of rationality and scientism that emerges from Enlightenment thinking. And of course, a lot of people have criticized that. Well, certainly a lot of traditional conservatives have criticized that, but some leftists, ironically, the Frankfurt School, were critical of scientism. But that kind of thinking is clearly very, very pervasive among modern progressives and leftists. This deification of science and medicine as well. There are a lot of people who think of themselves as progressive, but they simply, they revere scientists and doctors the way that the right might revere a priest. Like the right reveres the guys in the white collars, the left reveres the guys in the white coats, and it's really a similar type of way of thinking. And I know that a lot of people who are scientific heretics get a lot of bashing from the more conventional left, certainly mainstream progressives, for example, the anti-vaxxers and proponents of alternative medicine and stuff like that. And I'm not making any argument at present as to what the validity of any of those kinds of ideas is. But you do have this pervasive current, this way of thinking among a lot of people, a lot of liberal and left and progressive opinion that embraces scientism. I know when the pandemic started, I knew left anarchists who were putting memes on their social media where there was this quote from Bakunin. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, in matters of authority on watchmaking, I defer to the watchmakers, or something like that. And what Bakunin was saying is that, just because anarchists don't believe in state authority doesn't mean they don't recognize the authority of people with skills or expertise. For example, if you're want to get your car worked on, you defer to the authority of somebody who's an actual auto mechanic or something like that. And that's what Bakunin was talking about. When the pandemic came, there were anarchists who were putting that quote on their Facebook pages and stuff like that, were totally oblivious to the fact that the policies were being determined by state agencies like the Center for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health, and that some of the leading public figures that were involved in the development of some of these policies, like Dr. Anthony Fauci, have in the past been involved in major screw-ups when it comes to public health issues. Like I remember Anthony Fauci from the 80s was saying things like, AIDS, it was going to be another bubonic plague and kill a third of the world and stuff like that. This idea that science and medicine and these things have some kind of infallibility is an idea that a lot of progressive types take very seriously, but in a way that I think is a bit wrong-headed. And I do think that they do take a what you would call a conservative approach to this, in the sense that for them, science and medicine really are the new church. I mean, as I said, they defer to the guys in the white coats the same way someone on the right might defer to the guys in the white collars. You mentioned Foucault. Foucault is interesting because Foucault, as we know, was a big hero to this kind of postmodern critical theory left. But if you go back and you actually read his work, he was actually very critical of medicine. He was very critical of the psychiatric field. He was critical of prisons and all of these kinds of things, because he saw all of these as instruments of social control. He saw psychiatry, medicine as instruments of social control, because one thing that I think fed into that was that Foucault was gay. So in his generation, homosexuality was considered a mental illness, and people that were homosexual could be subject to psychiatric incarceration, and what they used to use electric shock therapy as a supposed cure for homosexuality. And of course, a lot of jurisdictions considered homosexuality to be a crime. You could be sent to jail for being a homosexual. So Foucault criticized medicine and psychiatry and as well as prisons and all of that as an instrument of social control in this kind of sense. What's interesting, though, is that contemporary leftists seem to have done an about face on that. They've sort of embraced the superiority of science, and I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, if you go back and you look at what progressives were into 100 years ago, they always had this kind of scientistic type of outlook, like eugenics, for example. This idea that you could actually, engineer human evolution to make it produce the results you want. That grew out of this kind of scientistic thinking. In fact, I think it's Exhibit A in terms of why scientism is not a good idea, why you should be just as skeptical of science as you would be of anything. You should be just as skeptical of the scientific and medical establishment as you are of the political establishment or the religious establishment or the media establishment or the economic establishment. There's in those kinds of institutions. I do believe that there's a legitimate scientific method. I do believe that there's a such thing as a legitimate scientific process and things that we can know as scientific knowledge through demonstrable experiments and things like that. So I'm not saying that science is just all made up, and like there are some radical postmodernists who took the idea that believing in the flat earth is just as legitimate as believing in the spherical earth, because it's all just somebody's opinion and we can't really know anything. I don't take anti-science that far. I'm not an anti-vaxxer or any of that stuff either. But I do think that there are too many people who are too deferent to the authority of medicine, science, technology, all of these kinds of modern ways of thinking, in a way they wouldn't be normally to any other institution, like, for example, religion or astrologers or something like that.
I'd agree with you, Keith, that a lot of the left engage in scientism, particularly the progressive left. Although even if you are scientistic, the problem still raises its head. Well, which science and who do you listen to? Interesting with respect to the coronavirus and the medical responses. A lot of the predictions that took place with respect to who would die, etc., from it were not actually created by scientists who are medical scientists as such. They were just computer modelers who just took the data in and then just ran their big computer black box. That's certainly what can never remember his name. It's Neil or Niall Ferguson of Imperial College did. And yeah, you have the left anarchists going, oh no, believe the science. So there's significantly more disputes in, not that there isn't any consensus, but there's more disputes in scientific fields than a lot of people in the mainstream at least will give them credit for. And it just seems ironic that the some of those left anarchists you were pointing out, saying, oh, listen to the science, it's like, well, they'll just listen to the government scientists and the ones who are associated with the state, and somehow those are the ones who are correct. Whereas the ones who aren't, I know it's interesting ones are probably the retired ones because they don't have any financial interest in keeping people happy. And they say things are different, but then, oh no, we need to follow the science, and then they'll all go, we are enhancing freedom by encouraging organizations like Facebook and Twitter to go on crazed fact-checking exercises if anything that's heretical appears, and we have to get rid of it. A good example of that is a former epidemiologist who was a professor. Various interviews of him for coronavirus were removed from YouTube for violating terms of service. A guy called Nutwatowski. So yeah, I do think that's the way the left do take with scientism, and does show how by promoting freedom through healthcare, by giving it to the state, it can diminish it. Tim?
As far as scientism is concerned, I would agree with much of what you both said. But Keith mentioned Foucault. Foucault is interesting. I mean, for as much as some people on the right dismiss him, actually, he's quite libertarian. Maybe not in the libertarian Hans Hoppe way, but definitely libertarian in the early Murray Rothbard way. And I mean, actually, Gary Habermas, Frankfurt School, different Habermas, dismissed him as a young conservative. I mean, if you read Foucault's Birth of a Clinic, he opens up with now sometimes he gets parodied for saying this, but the first role of the doctor is political. I mean, I would actually agree with that. I mean, I do think there are things that can be known, and things that can be known out there, quote unquote, scientifically. But to a certain extent, in this way, going to the doctor is somewhat different than going to get your car fixed. I mean, there's this sort of, what a functioning car looks like. The line between a functioning person and an unfunctioning person is much more gray and nebulous. I mean, in some ways, people probably peak when they're 22 or 23 physically and spend the rest of their lives falling apart. I don't think that's that far of a stretch. I mean, we're temporary. I mean, as much as Ray Kurzweil is trying to live forever, we don't live forever. And things like, what I think is interesting is like right to die, euthanasia, all those things. They're very interesting. And actually, end of life healthcare. That's never a way in which I'm not sure of how democratic the current paradigm is of healthcare. It does seem like there's a resource shift from the young and I'm going to use the word productive to the old. I think this is definitely the case in the United States with the Social Security as well as with the NHS. I mean, you can see a sort of a resource transfer. And actually, with the coronavirus, that's actually one of the ideas is, you have to protect the vulnerable and the elderly. And actually, Foucault in an interview points out that this is a great interview. Actually, Jacobin picked up on this and expanded on the point of being a conservative libertarian. Is like, in the interview, Foucault says that, there is a kind of moral calculus. There's a kind of calculus that goes on where you have to choose between how many dialysis patients and how many. There are certain things. Now, of course, you can always produce more things. And I do agree with both of your points you made about how there's licensing restrictions and the state gets in the way, patents. I agree entirely with that. But on some level, producing an MRI machine, even if you had some sort of perfect Kevin Carson freed market, is still a finite, labor-intensive industry. And there's actually only so many MRI machines or ventilators we want to produce. So I do think there are technical limits, and I think there's technical limits of how long, at what cost is continuing to live worth it. Now, what are some interesting left-wing thinkers that think that way of your view? I mean, Foucault to me has long think there. Actually, but it's not even clear that Foucault is is some people are claiming him as right wing. He says it disorients them. Even Thad Russell, who's sort of a follower of Foucault, from what I see, he interviews libertarians mainly. So are there any left-wing thinkers that think that way? And as far as the finite amount of resources, do you agree with that point that was made, Keith?
I'm not sure if I understand the first part of your question. Are there left-wing thinkers that think in what kind of way? Could you repeat that?
Oh, of course. Are there any left-wing thinkers that continue in that tradition? I mean, of course you have that's unrelated, but the deschooling point. But as far as healthcare, you brought up my experience of the left anarchists. I somewhat see they've been largely follow the NHS, follow the CDC, follow whatever they say, trust the state, which I can see why they're saying that. I can see why they're saying, but I've always thought the state role is political and it has a controlling motive. Are there any left anarchists that you've followed that have not done that? Because my experience has been what Swithin's was pointing out before too.
Well, none that really stand out, not in contemporary times. I mean, I know individuals who were somewhat heterodox among the left anarchists who have sort of this kind of independent thinking. They're more in the vein of a Camille Paglia type or something like that. This kind of someone who's left but doesn't mind bashing their own side or whatever. Occasionally I come across people like that, but no, I think that since this whole lockdown thing started, the left anarchist milieu has been very aggressively pro-lockdown and pretty much in favor of the orthodoxy of what the establishment is telling us. They're dismissing dissenting points of view as right-wing conspiracy theories or some kind of crypto-fascist plot or whatever. In a way that I think is very, foolish and disconcerting, because, I mean, what a massive power grab this has been. I know a lot of the left anarchists are really into immigrants' rights and support open borders and stuff like that. Well, the lockdown has done wonders for closing borders. I mean, this is like the immigration restrictionist wet dream, because of the way that borders have been shut down. Like, I'm American right now. Americans are banned from the European Union. I think there are ways you can get around that, but for all practical purposes, formally at least, Americans are banned from the European Union. So it really is interesting to me the way that the left anarchist milieu have just become sort of like a parody of the Democratic Party. Like, I've always, for many years, have said they're basically just I'm talking about the United States. They are the anarcho-democratic party, or they are basically what Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity think the Democratic Party is. Like, if you watch some of these guys on Fox News, they're always talking about how the Antifa are the Democratic Party's militia, and they're making it sound like Bernie Sanders is puppet mastering Joe Biden, and of course it's really Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who's puppet mastering Bernie Sanders, and of course AOC is really just a female Hugo Chavez or something. You have this kind of crazy conspiratorial, exaggerated ideas like that coming from the right. But the left anarchists, they're kind of like what the Fox News talking heads imagine the Democrats to be. It's like they're sort of like a Democratic Party parody, and that's something about the left anarchist milieu that I do find very, disconcerting, and a reason why I don't have anything to do with them and haven't for a long time. I mean, except for individuals here and there. It's I think a more interesting point of discussion when these kinds of things are being addressed is this question: well, what would be an optimal way to go about delivering healthcare services without having to be hyper dependent on either governments or big corporations or big insurance companies and stuff like that? And I think there's any number of ways that could be done. But there's that's something that I don't really see any of the parties to these kinds of debates talking about. It's like in the United States, they talk about, well, we want healthcare reform, which basically means they just want to have the Canadian system in the United States or something like that. Or the right says no, the big pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies and medical companies, they should run the healthcare system. And I don't really see anybody anywhere, left, right, or anywhere else, talking very often about what a healthcare system would look like that's not dependent on all these kinds of massive institutions, or whether that would be possible, or how a healthcare system of that type would be paid for or organized, or what its efficiencies or deficiencies might be. And I'd like to see more discussion of that, but unfortunately it never really seems to take place. And the scientism issue really is a problem. I see that with the environmental issue. You see people on the progressive side of the spectrum who push scientific orthodoxy like it's church doctrine. And even to the point that they now call people who reject the prevailing view of climate sciences, they call them climate change deniers or climate science deniers or whatever. Essentially they're comparing them to Holocaust deniers, implying they're basically the moral equivalent of Nazis or something like that. Even to the point that some people actually want to outlaw or criminalize climate change denial in the same way that they want to outlaw hate speech, or the way that some countries have laws against genocide denials and things like that. And then it's also sort of a religious component to this. When we talk about environmentalism, it's talking that they have a quasi-naturistic, almost pantheistic view of nature. It's almost animistic in a way, and I think that overlaps with the kind of scientism they hold to in other areas. So it's interesting to take a look at this whole ideological framework they utilize and point out some of the holes in it, and point out, as you said, Tim, how conservative some of this is. I mean, when I look at all of the things that contemporary progressives believe, I always find all these amazing parallels, not only with 20th century totalitarianism like Stalinism and National Socialism and things like that, but also with pre-modern ways of thinking. This fixation on identity politics, race and gender, it reminds me of the fixation on ascribed status and caste status that you had in pre-modern societies, or the way that scientism and therapeutism and all of that have become the new church, and then they defend scientific orthodoxy like it's church orthodoxy or something of that nature.
Keith, do you find that the left have a similar approach to education? Do they take the idea that only sort of a mainstream style of education is the right way, or do they tend to be more favourable to more a diverse sort of range of educational methods and styles? And what do they generally think of things of like home education or other sort of alternative non-state forms of education? I seem to remember you put a quote up from Gillis from the Centre for a Stateless Society. I think he argued that he preferred public schools to home education because they were better on like trans rights, if I remember correctly.
You find a range of opinions on the U.S. left about things like that, because on one hand you have some people on the left who are more countercultural types. It's the same with the alternative medicine and all that. You have a sector of the left that's more countercultural and really embraces alternative medicine and homeschooling and unschooling and free schooling and the whole A.S. Neal's Summerhill model of schooling and things like that. This kind of old counterculture left. But then you also have another left that has this kind of educationist, this kind of progressive, managerialist, scientific, educationist outlook. And they tend to be very hostile to homeschooling, primarily because they think, well, homeschooling is either going to be right-wing nutcases teaching ignorant theological doctrines and racism and homophobia to children, or it's going to be left-wing nutcases teaching anti-vaxxerism and flat eartherism and astrology and Eastern mysticism to children. So they tend to have a very hostile view, I think, towards homeschooling. Yeah. Gillis is one of the people that is when said earlier, the left anarchists are like a Democratic Party parody. A lot of them are. He's sort of a parody of a left anarchist. Like he's sort of like a William Gillis, Center for a Stateless Society. If you were trying to come up with a cartoon character that's sort of going to be a parody of what a left anarchist is, well, that's it. Gillis would be that character. I mean, you couldn't really parody Gillis because he parodies himself. But and I don't think I'm being unfair, by the way, by saying that. I mean, check out the guy's Twitter feed, read the stuff the guy writes. But yeah, he once said that he was opposed to homeschooling, or at least thought less of it than he did public schooling, because public schooling is at least enlightened culturally. They teach the kids multiculturalism and eco-consciousness and diversity and rainbow, celebrate Pride Month and all that kind of stuff. Whereas in homeschools, a lot of those are religious families that educate their kids with this kind of Christian fundamentalist theological outlook, or something else that people like Gillis would say are reactionary and backward and things like that. And that kind of thinking is very pervasive among liberals and leftists in the United States. There are exceptions. There's a sector of the left, a more countercultural left. It's more of a genuine anti-authoritarian, unschoolers, no schoolers, and all that kind of stuff. I know many years ago I used to know this woman, this anarchist woman, who was kind of a hippie-ish type, and she used to say, and she was what she called a no schooler. She refused to send her kids to school. And she said, yeah, ironically, it's these Christian fundamentalists who are keeping me out of jail, when these leftists want to put me in jail for violating truancy laws. And I think that's a fairly accurate assessment of where the left in the U.S. stands on these kinds of things.
One of the funny things, like healthcare, you said that how conservative the left and left anarchists as well as progressive are. Because I think education, it follows the same way. They're very conservative about what they think education consists of, and what they think education ought to be. Education primarily consists of a teacher or a lecturer standing in front of 10 to 30 students in a building in a big city or in the center of your town. It's a very boring form of education, which actually I'd argue is in some ways it's enlightened, in some ways it's unenlightened. In some ways it just. Public schools in some ways are authoritarian. It's just a exercise in getting people to sit still for an hour listening to some boring speaker who is just working for a salary, who doesn't really care about what he's talking about anyway. Often I think sometimes the right oversells the universities. Plenty of professors are in there. I do think universities are radical, but I do think there's plenty of university professors there just there in the same way that you have someone working at McDonald's or Sheetz. So in some ways, I don't think universities are as much the center of enlightenment. And again, it's the YouTube has been a boon for people, and YouTube and the internet in general has been a boon for homeschoolers. Actually, that's one of the upsides of lockdown. More people are homeschooling. It's a sort of alternative education. And of course, there are some people on the quote unquote left who do that. Although a person like you brought up with Camelia Paglia, she gets oftentimes now dismissed as a right winger, which is, she appears on Cato, and they'll invite her, and then and she might appear mention Charles Murray, and then she's in the modern day culture gets tagged as deplorable, basically. So I do think education follows the similar conservative pathway. That schools are quite authoritarian, and that's another way to stick that go behind. I'm very suspicious about the origins of public schools. The Property and Freedom Society about 5 years ago had a great lecture about origins of the mass education in France. The French education system was literally developed in order to nationalize France and make a good army. That was the explicit goal. He brought up quote after the Franco-Prussian War, they had a quote from the French education. He said that the Germans won this last war because they had a better education system. The schoolmaster will win the next war. So the fact that left anarchists say education is full of enlightenment, unless they think nationalized wars are the peak of the Enlightenment, I do think there's a sort of dodgy relationship with Enlightenment values, if such things exist, and what is taught in state schools. Again, different societies, state schools, but most societies have some form of state education. I mean, again, it goes back to the scientist question: what exactly is, whether someone in Montana or Northern England is teaching them creationism. I mean, I that's a question about what is and isn't science. But Keith, do you have any final thoughts about what I just said about the conservatism in education, and any final thoughts before we pass it to Swithin to wrap it up?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, what conservatives tend to object to about the educational system is they just don't like the ideological paradigm that tends to be dominant in it. I tend to be in favor of diversity in education in the sense of diversity of methods of education, diversity of, who's doing the teaching and things like that. I suppose if I could make one reform to education in the United States, it would be that I would just simply abolish compulsory school attendance laws. I would abolish the truancy laws. If public school could be there for people who want to go, or parents who want to send their kids, or if they want to have home schools or private schools or church schools, or some A.S. Neal Summerhill schools, or schools like the modern school that Francisco Ferrer, the Spanish anarchist Francisco Ferrer came up with. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, but don't make attendance of any of these mandatory. And then as far as healthcare, I don't know if I had to make one change to the healthcare system. I'm not sure what it would be. I think I would probably repeal laws that constrict the supply of health care. For example, allowing for what they call advanced nurse practitioners to have more prerogatives in terms of the kinds of treatments they provide and stuff like that as well. And it's I don't think that, though, that the important point behind everything we've talked about, I think, is that we can't rely on the state to administer all of these kinds of systems in a way that's going to be efficient or humane or equitable. And we can't necessarily rely on any other kind of institution that requires some sort of central planning mechanism. I mean, I don't know that some big, giant medical corporation is going to be that much more pleasant to deal with as a patient than a state system like the NHS is going to be.
I would agree with your policies primarily, Keith. I think in both education and health, the main thing is to liberate, as it were, the supply side, in a sense, and to allow more diversity with doctors and nurse practitioners, compulsory attendance laws, etc. I think that certainly would yield the best outcome more than anything else. And thank you for appearing again, Keith. It was an interesting talk with you. And an interesting book that listeners might be interested in reading by Keith is Thinkers Against Modernity. Whilst it doesn't touch exactly on the same topics as we touched today, it focuses on some sort of anti-modernist thinkers and summarizes their work. I'd just now like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify or Podbean. And if you'd like to get into contact with the show, with any ideas for future episodes or some general comments, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.